He thought the fight was over. After years of grueling missions as a Navy SEAL, he had finally earned peace. A quiet home, a fresh start, and a chance to leave the battlefield behind. But peace didn't last. One morning, the sound of fists pounding on his door shattered the calm. Uniformed cops, acting on orders from the HOA, screamed, "You're in violation," before smashing their way inside. It wasn't about safety, it was about control. What they didn't realize was whose door they had just broken down. This time, they hadn't picked on a helpless neighbor. They had declared war on the wrong man, and his payback would reach straight into the heart of their headquarters. Before the chaos, life had been steady, almost ordinary. After years of grueling deployments as a Navy SEAL, he returned home hoping for something simple: mornings with coffee on the porch, quiet evening runs, and the feeling of finally belonging to a community rather than a battlefield. His home wasn't just a house. It was a symbol of survival, a place where the memories of combat could fade into something resembling peace. Neighbors saw him as reserved, even distant. But behind that silence was a man who had given everything for his country. His pride wasn't in medals or recognition. It was in the simple act of reclaiming normal life. And for a time, he thought he had found it. But beneath the manicured lawns and smiling faces, the neighborhood carried a shadow. The HOA. They moved through the streets like watchmen, measuring lawns, scanning driveways, policing the smallest details of daily life. A trash bin left out too long. A fence painted the wrong shade. A truck parked an inch past the line. To most, it was irritating. To him, it was absurd. First, he dismissed it. He'd faced enemies far more dangerous than a group of homeowners with clipboards. But the letters came anyway, slipped under his door, stamped with threats of fines and penalties. Each one harsher than the last. Each one hinting at a storm gathering just out of sight. And storms, as he knew too well, never pass quietly. The first time he found a notice taped to his door, he barely glanced at it. Violation. Trash bin visibility. He crumpled it and tossed it aside. But the notices didn't stop. Week after week, new accusations appeared. Grass too long. Paint not regulation color. Vehicle parked improperly. They weren't warnings anymore. They were attacks. Each envelope felt less like a reminder and more like a threat. At first, he ignored them, but ignoring only seemed to make things worse. The fines grew larger, the letters more aggressive. Soon, neighbors started whispering. Some avoided his gaze. Others seemed to take satisfaction in his struggle. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules, they were isolating him, tightening the noose one piece of paper at a time. And then came the unthinkable. It started with a pounding at dawn, fists hammering against his door like a battering ram. He rose instinctively, years of combat training snapping to life. Through the peephole, he saw uniforms. Not soldiers, not federal agents. Local cops, 6 of them, lined across his porch, their voices thundering. "Open up! You're in violation!" He hesitated, confused. A violation? With armed police? Before he could respond, a boot slammed against the frame, splintering wood as the door cracked inward. They weren't there to talk. They were there to intimidate, to humiliate, to make an example out of him. The neighbors gathered quickly, phones out, recording as the officers stormed his entryway. One officer shoved past, knocking over a chair. Another barked orders, his hand resting on the grip of his weapon as if this were a raid. But there was no crime, no drugs, no danger. Just a man whose only offense was standing his ground against a homeowners association drunk on power. He stayed calm, silent, steady. Years of discipline kept his fists at his sides, his mind collected. But behind that calm, something darker stirred. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was war declared on his home. And war was the one language he understood better than anyone else. The officers finally left, leaving behind a shattered doorframe, a ransacked entryway, and a man who looked less like a victim and more like a storm waiting to break. As the neighbors whispered and the HOA congratulated themselves on their show of force, he began making phone calls. Quiet, measured, deliberate. These weren't calls to lawyers. Not yet. These were calls to men who had stood beside him in deserts and jungles. Men who knew the weight of loyalty. Men who would answer without hesitation. Former SEALs. Brothers in arms. The HOA thought they had cornered him. What they had really done was awaken a team that thrived under pressure. A unit trained to respond when the odds looked impossible. And once that team set its sights on the HOA, there would be no going back. The HOA board sat comfortably in their headquarters that evening. A sterile office lined with binders and rules, congratulating themselves on restoring order to the neighborhood. They believed their show of force had crushed him into silence. But silence was never surrender. When the convoy arrived, it didn't announce itself with sirens or flashing lights. It came quiet, controlled, precise, the way only a SEAL team would move. Black SUVs rolled up in formation, doors opening in perfect sync. Out stepped men who carried themselves differently than any officer or rent-a-cop the HOA had ever known. Their eyes scanned, their steps measured. Calm, focused, dangerous. Within seconds, the atmosphere shifted. The HOA members who had barked orders so freely now froze, their confidence draining away. These weren't angry neighbors with complaints. These were warriors. Men who had stood face to face with warlords and insurgents. Men who knew how to dismantle a threat without raising their voices. The leader, the homeowner they thought they had broken, stepped forward. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply placed a file folder on the polished boardroom table. Inside were records, proof of the HOA's illegal fines, misuse of police contacts, and the raid that had violated his rights. Evidence, collected methodically, backed by witness accounts and video footage. The board members shifted uncomfortably, their faces pale. They were no longer in control. And then came the part they didn't expect. His team wasn't just there with documents. They were there with a plan. Every angle of corruption had been mapped, every abusive practice documented. With military precision, they dismantled the facade of power the HOA had built piece by piece. By the time he finished, the once proud board sat in silence, staring at a man they had underestimated. They had tried to intimidate a veteran. Instead, they had awakened a force they couldn't contain. And what came next would echo far beyond their headquarters. The fallout came quickly. The HOA that once strutted through the neighborhood with clipboards and threats suddenly found itself under investigation. The evidence his team delivered didn't just expose petty violations. It uncovered years of corruption, financial abuse, and illegal coordination with local police. Within weeks, the board members were facing hearings, fines of their own, and the public humiliation of being dragged into the spotlight they once used to shame others. For the neighbors, it was a revelation. Those who had once stood by silently now whispered in awe. The man they thought was just another quiet veteran had done what no one else dared. He had faced the HOA head-on and forced them to answer for their crimes. His door had been broken, but his spirit had not. In fact, it was stronger than ever. As for him, victory wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about showing force. It was about principle. He hadn't fought for medals overseas only to surrender his rights at home. His message was clear. Freedom doesn't end at your front door. The neighborhood would never be the same. Some saw him as a hero, others simply as a warning that power unchecked will always meet resistance. And the HOA once feared, now lived in the shadow of its own disgrace. He rebuilt his door. He rebuilt his peace. But the memory of that morning, the pounding fists, the splintering wood, the injustice of it all, remained carved into his mind. It became a reminder of something bigger, because this wasn't just one man's story. It was the story of anyone who has ever been pushed too far, of communities held hostage by those drunk on control, of silence broken by courage. And the question that lingered long after was this: how many more will have to fight back before those in power finally learn their lesson?